And you can hear me okay in Dunkirk and Olean as well? So the first thing I want to do is just go back to the assignment that's due on Friday. I think we're okay, Corey? Thank you. So I just put the assignment up again. I've since sent it out to our two remote folks. So it's due Friday. I just want to always start class, see if you have any questions about it, so that it's not causing anybody any problems. Anybody have a question or comment or concern? Are we okay in Olean and Dunkirk? Again, if anybody gets it done early and you want to give it to me, that's fine too, but it's not necessary. I won't grade them until I get them all together anyways. So we think we're okay? Yes, ma'am.
You just want us to bring a hard copy to class on Friday?
You can either send it to me as an attachment to email or just bring it right to class.
Okay.
Unfortunately, with this class, I'll never be able to get over to Dunkirk and Olean at 9 because of the technology. I don't think they could pull this off in Olean, so I'd like to get over there for a couple of my classes, but yeah, hard copy is fine. You just
Okay.
give it to me. Anybody else have a small question? If we're okay? So who wants to tell me what's important about tomorrow night? That might have a relationship to the class.
Wasn't the election mentioned?
The who?
You mentioned an election last week. Is that what it is?
Well, there's the Iowa caucuses for the Democratic Party tonight. But that has only, it's remotely related. I don't think I've heard any of the candidates discuss Palestine in Iowa. Probably haven't been asked. Nice try. What's happening tomorrow night that could have a relationship to our class? No, take a sip of my lukewarm hot coffee. Who's talking tomorrow night? How about that? Why is it important to us potentially? Nobody? Supposedly the greatest friend that Israel has ever had, according to Mr. Netanyahu. Who? And who is Mr. Netanyahu? Say what?
The State of the Union address?
Yeah, well, that's not who Mr. Netanyahu is, but yes, tomorrow night is the State of the Union address. And since you were nice enough to say that, who's Mr. Netanyahu?
He's the Prime Minister of Israel.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.
So, actually, what do President Trump and Mr. Netanyahu have in common other than their position on Israel?
They're both in impeachment.
Well, in effect, they're both indicted in case of Trump, although he's probably going to be acquitted Wednesday. Prime Minister Netanyahu is indicted on criminal matters, but they can't prosecute him until he's no longer the prime minister.
Mhm.
So I guess birds of a feather flock together.
How long does somebody run or have an office for prime minister?
There's no term limits typically.
Oh, it's just until you're like voted out, kind of?
You die, you removed, you quit, you get defeated.
Mm.
I mean, originally in the American Constitution, there were no limits on the presidency. That was done after Franklin Roosevelt. So, and there's no, in the Constitution, there's no other term limits except the presidency. So typically a prime minister, there might be some exception out there, but as long as they win the election, although Netanyahu has an election early March,
Mhm.
and then he has to try to form the government, and then if he can't, he's out, and then the criminal prosecutions can proceed against him. Yeah, kind of feels like Trump, that he shouldn't have to be answerable to anybody, which is bad news. But the president, I think, well, I'm sure he's going to talk about something to do with foreign policy. And his plan to bring peace into Palestine and Israel was released last week. And then I had yesterday's Sunday New York Times, and the Sunday New York Times basically said this peace proposal is dead on arrival. The Palestinians were never consulted, and it's just not going anyplace. But I'm sure the president will, because he's called it the greatest peace proposal ever put forward. But you know, with Donald Trump, the problem is everything that he puts forward is the greatest ever. And so at some point, that loses its meaning, because not everything you do can be the greatest ever, and it's just bad history. But he's attempting to solve the problem, but the Palestinians have boycotted any of the negotiations. So I don't know what he's going to talk about tonight. I mean, this is a really bizarre situation where you have a president still, well, he was impeached. The trial's still going on, most likely get acquitted on Wednesday, but it's still going to stand up in front of the Senate and the House and give a State of the Union address, which is a constitutional requirement in Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. So the reason I want us to pay attention to it is I have trouble, because of my own political leanings, listening to the man. That's my failure. Don't make it your failure. I try, but sometimes I just get so upset that I can't do it. So I can read about him and read what he says, and then I stay pretty calm. So I'm going to try to rally myself to watch it. If not, I will read about it. But what I would like you to pay attention to it, whether you can actually watch it or not, because he is likely to bring up the Palestinian peace plan that he put forward. So it does relate to what we're doing. So I've only talked about it a little bit. At some point, we might take a look at the New York Times editorial that says this thing's just not going anyplace. But I don't know if anyone else saw any news coverage of it. I just saw that over the weekend because I had a little more time on my hands. Sometimes during the week, I don't have a lot of time because of everything I'm doing. So, well, one, if anyone saw anything, you have a question, please let me know. And secondly, either watch it tomorrow night. It's going to be on every channel known to God. It'll be videotaped. It'll be everywhere the next morning. And so, and again, I don't know if he's going to bring up Palestine, but I would suspect he's going to bring up Palestine, North Korea, and maybe England sort of leaving the EU as of last Friday. Okay. They said they left, but they're still following all the rules. So are you in or are you out? But it's very confusing. And the British, of course, are often blamed for causing the mess at the end of World War II that started us down this path of endless conflict in Palestine. But I've been sort of, between that article and some of the other stuff I've been doing with you, trying to avoid this whole idea, and even the assignment just, I've been kind of slow getting into the present situation because too often Palestine is viewed through this framework of endless conflict, when in fact, that's a relatively recent phenomenon of the last 100 years. Now, in the course of human history, 100 years is a recent phenomenon, especially if you excuse me. Oh my. Especially if you accept my premise that the history of Palestine is 4,000 years long. What's 100 years? It's a drop in the bucket. Well, we tend to look at Palestine through the framework of the last 100 years instead of the last 3,900 years, which is why I had that one article. So, and we'll continue. So we got several things going on. And so the other thing is, of course, the simulation. I know people are starting from all of my classes that are participating, requesting this scenario. And as soon as we get done with this assignment, we got to start talking about preparing opening statements. So has anyone given any thought to being the president of the PA or one of the ministers? Especially if you've got the simulation scenario and you had a chance to look at it. Although please still request it via email. Or a question about the roles before I do anything else? Yes, ma'am.
As far as the Minister of the Environment goes, you talked about in class, like the water problem where the Israeli government takes it and then like resells it. Is that something that we could talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Joyce has her issue in the scenario and then has questions for consideration. But because we're playing the role of Palestine, we are allowed in the negotiations to bring up issues of concern to us.
Okay.
And access to water
Mm-hmm.
in an area that's starved for rainfall is extremely important. So yeah, absolutely, that can be an issue that we bring up.
Okay.
And might have to do a little research on the shortage of water and the Israelis taking our water and then selling it back to us. But sure, yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So each of my delegations will be bringing up stuff particular to them that is not discussed by Joyce in the scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And that's to give it a more real flavor that, you know, we know something about our country, or in our case, non-country, and I want to put it forward and let the world know about it, especially because the United States will be in the negotiations. So sometimes Palestine is likely, even in the simulated world, to get into what I call a spitting match with the U.S. And so, yeah, absolutely. And were you thinking about being the environment minister?
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Anybody else thinking about? Oh, yes, and Olean?
I have a question.
Sure.
Are these actual people? They're actually an environment minister and a human rights minister?
You know,
There's not a-
typically, yes, in any country there would be. And they're not always called economics minister. Like, you know, in the United States, it's the Secretary of Commerce, who is in effect the economics minister. The Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare would be the health minister, but, yeah, we don't have a health, education, and welfare. I think the EPA is under them. I don't even remember. And then, you know, with migration in the United States, we have a Department of Labor, so it would be called the Secretary of Labor. But for our purposes, when we do a delegation, I just use that blanket term, even though that might be technically a more official position or person and name. If you can find it, that's great. But, you know, typically, we just say on behalf of the Economics Ministry of the Palestinian Authority, blah, blah, blah. If you find the actual department or a person because you did some research, that's great. But yeah, these are typically actual real people. I just don't necessarily go by the terms that we give them for purposes of the negotiation. And this idea of calling them a minister is typically what you find in parliamentary systems. So England has ministers, where in the United States, the head of our departments are called secretaries. So typically a country with a parliamentary system will have a foreign affairs minister. The United States has a Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo. It's the same thing, we just use different titles. And of course, the United States is always different. But even if you go up to Canada, our nearest neighbor, they call their heads of departments ministers. But they also don't call them departments. You know, in Canada, it's, you know, the Environment Ministry in Canada is called Environment Canada. So everybody does it a little differently. But to go to your question, yes, these would be real people reporting to President of us. And of course, the problem with the Palestinian Authority is I guess I'd call us a quasi-state, because some countries have recognized our right to exist. And so we try to function as a state, but we really aren't. Not, you know, certainly the United States doesn't recognize us. But supposedly this peace plan that the president came up was supposed to give us our own state, although when I started reading some of the stuff about it, we're still not an independent sovereign state the way I understand it. So we're in a unique position. Some countries like Sweden have said, yes, Palestine has a right to exist as an independent nation state. God bless the Swedes and a few other countries, but we're still not our own country. But yes, real people in real ministries, but not always by those titles. Whereas President Abbas is a real person. He's the president of the PA, although not necessarily all that popular, even with Palestinians. Yes.
Can I actually change?
You don't want to be environment minister?
Can I be human rights?
Sure.
Okay.
Why are you suddenly the change?
I just feel like I know more and could be more aware of the human rights than the environment.
It's fine with me.
Okay.
Did you get a copy of the? Okay.
Mhm.
And one of the issues for Palestine with labor is that a lot of Palestinians work in Israel,
Mhm.
not in the occupied territories, and so there's issues with getting through the checkpoints.
Yes.
And getting to work on time and needing permits to go work there. We don't have, one of the issues that Joyce is saying is, how do we achieve freedom of movement of workers throughout the world? Well, as Palestinians, we got a problem. We can't even freely move
In your own place.
from our occupied territories into Israel.
Mhm.
So, one of the things I would suggest doing, but, we'll work on this, is how can we talk about freedom of movement in the world when we can't even freely move in our own country?
Mhm.
I think that's a real issue.
Yeah.
Palestinians are always getting to work late, always having to leave early. It makes it very difficult. People get fired because they can't get to work. So we don't have freedom of movement. You got to have permits and proper identification and go through the checkpoints. Well, man, where's the freedom of movement? Well, it's not there. So.
Yeah.
Yes.
Could I be like in the human rights group?
You don't want to be a minister?
Not really.
Well, it's up to the right now.
Yeah.
Well, that was quick.
Yeah.
The potential minister, we'll firm these up on Swell Friday, but if it's okay with you, it's okay with me.
Okay.
And any particular reason you want to be in that ministry?
I'm like a human services major, so
Oh,
I'm kind of
okay.
like aligned with that.
Yeah, I often ask you to take advantage of your own expertise or what you might know because of what you've already been doing. And that's certainly a human issue. The environment is, and trade is more esoteric, I guess, but this is truly about people being able to move and make a living so they can feed their kids and have their families survive. And so it really does become down to a human service issue, which typically we don't think of it that way, but it is. How are you supposed to feed your family if you can't get to work? And there's a fairly high unemployment rate in the occupied territories, too. So if they have freedom of movement, there's also the problem of freedom of movement for intellectuals, like people I met at the universities who are well-educated, PhDs, published. They try to go to conferences in Europe or the United States, and the Israeli government either turns them down or gives them permission after the conference is over. And all they want to do is go and talk about their research and their expertise, and the Israeli government basically makes it impossible for them to move around. So how, that's a labor issue, obviously a white collar, way up there, PhD professor level, but they're not treated any better than the guy who needs to go across the border to clean toilets in an Israeli hotel. It's really just awful. There is no freedom of movement for labor, like there is for the most part in the United States. If you don't find a job here, you want to move, you pack up and move. Can't do that down there if you're Palestinian. So yes, we might have the beginnings of a labor department, or whatever we call ourselves. So anybody else given any thought? Got to do this by Friday. Not all at once, you'll overwhelm me.
So, wait, which roles have you guys discussed over there? I didn't quite hear everything.
Oh, I'm sorry, what was the problem, the volume or?
Well, you were talking about the labor and I.
Well, because somebody volunteered to be the labor minister with this issue of human rights, and somebody volunteered to be in that ministry. I'm sorry if you didn't hear it.
No, so it's not like official?
No, we'll set this in stone on Swell Friday.
Okay.
So at this point, I'm just recruiting interest, although I think we've got that ministry set. But I still need the other two, and I need the president. And I know, don't be scared by being president. You'd be working with me. I'm not gonna leave you out there all by yourself, and you'll be working with your fellows. So, but yes.
Do you see it like, I'm just trying to think like how it's gonna work with us all working together remotely. Do you think that's gonna be an issue, or like how are we gonna handle that, I guess?
Well, this is a bigger issue in my other class, because I've never tried to do the simulation on a three-way. And this is actually a four-way, because we got the two remote students. We'll have to be just a little more flexible and creative, but we can do it. Because once the simulation starts and it goes live, and you have the sign-in information and the password, we can all get in it at any time. So when we're posting messages, we can do them out of class, but from time to time, we can look at them in class because I just pull it up on the computer. So it'll probably, the biggest challenge are going to be my two remote students. If they're hopefully going to watch this, because they're online students. And they've assured me that they've been tuning in. So, and then they ask me questions via email. But the other thing we can do, if everyone's okay with it, at least within ministries, we can, give me permission to share things via email, for purposes of the class. So we can work it out. It's going to be a little more challenging. Now, and typically when I do the sim, I try to get to the other campuses. The problem with this class, of course, is because of the camera, that's going to be precluded. And, I'm going to, at some point, try to get to Olean and Dunkirk. Dunkirk I could do. If I go to my 9 o'clock class, I could do Dunkirk and and then get back. Same thing with Olean, it'll be a little tight. But at some point I'll be doing that. But this class, I always have to be here. Yes?
As the ministers, do we only have to submit like the writing portion? Do we have to do any talking?
Well, the simulation is all text-based. You have to talk in class about, what you put up as a opening statement, but your talking in the simulation is all typing because it's all English, it's all text-based. Now, sometimes people suggest, well, is that what happens in the real world? Well, in the 21st century, a lot of negotiations before you get the heads of government together is basically done this way. So this is not out of the ordinary. And also, this simulation that we use, there's a high school one, there's a community college one, which we've been in for, I forget how long, we've been published 3 times and formally evaluated as to what students are learning. There's a college one, a 4-year college one, and then there's a professional one. So people who go to the State Department in the United States will go through the professional version of the very thing that we're doing. Now, obviously theirs is going to be a little more sophisticated because they're preparing to become actual negotiators, but it's the same system out of the University of Maryland, doing the same stuff, only at a higher level because they're going to actually be out in the real world doing it. Now, on the other hand, I have a student who graduated a long time ago. He did this simulation, he did the EU simulation, and then he ended up working for the Department of Commerce under President Obama. And his job was to do international negotiations, preparing papers for the president. We've kept in touch over the years. I mean, he really has this great job, although he was traveling the world. And if you asked him why did he do this, he said because he got so interested in negotiations from this simulation and the other one that he couldn't think of doing anything else with his life. And he's a Jamestown High School graduate, a JCC graduate, went on to Geneseo and George Washington, ended up with the Commerce Department, and then now works in the private sector. But he's still doing this stuff, basically international negotiations on a very high professional level. But it all started with this. So, and then I have another student who did all this and ended up getting a Marshall Scholarship to study for free in England to get his master's degree in public administration. And there's only 40 Marshall scholarships awarded across the United States. And Lars won one with my help because Northwestern, where he went, asked me for a letter. And we got it for him. So, and then I just had lunch with a former student of mine on Saturday. He did the simulations and he got a grant to study in England and work with a member of the UK Parliament. And now I got him a job up in Erie County, works for the county executive. So I've had a lot of, and I could go on, and I don't want to bore you, but I got a lot of students who've done this, got the bug, and said, I want to do this because this is the way I want to spend my life because it's fascinating, interesting. And and I enjoy it because I never know what the other countries are going to say. That was probably a long answer to your question. What was your original question? Oh, about,
What?
yeah, I remember, sorry. I get carried away, especially on Monday because I'm fairly rested. Usually as the week goes on, I get irritated because I'm involved in at least 2 negotiations with the city of Jamestown and other forces, and at least 2. And sometimes during the week, I get very frustrated with that. So I'm still doing this in the real world, not on an international scale. I mean, I'm negotiating with the Village of Faulkner. That's not exactly international, but it's still negotiations. And we have discussions about how to do this. And whenever I think about in the real world when I'm advising people, I'm thinking back to this simulated stuff. And the only way you can learn to do negotiations is just to do it. And then in the process, we can learn a lot about what it means to be a Palestinian, which of course is one of our concerns. So yes, we don't have to do talking except maybe in class. Like if you're one of the ministers and you prepare an opening statement, I would put it up on the camera and we would look at it together, both substantively and in terms of writing.
Could I be the environmental minister then?
Sure. All right. It's a good thing you gave it up.
I know.
So somebody here volunteered to be the environment minister. But we still have the economics and we still have President Abbas. So any other questions, comments?
So President, what's his, Abbas?
Abbas, yeah.
Is of Palestine or of Israel?
No, President Abbas is the head of the Palestinian Authority. Benjamin Netanyahu is the Prime Minister of Israel.
But so how is there a president if they're not technically a country?
Well, that's an excellent question. But there is something called the PA, which is the Palestinian Authority, which is currently has, I guess, the permission and a contract with the Israeli government to administer aspects of government at the level of Palestine. And they have elections, even though they don't have a nation state, and President Abbas won the last election.
Oh, okay.
Now, that's in the West Bank because Gaza is under the control of Hamas, alleged terrorist group. And they're not, part of the problem when you read this history is that the Israelis eventually with that dominant theme of Zionism were always, well, they weren't always united, but they kept working towards being united. The Palestinians just still aren't at that point. Now, I think part of it was deliberately what happens in negotiations, your enemies try to separate you, divide and conquer. And Palestinians have been divided, and they're physically divided with the Gaza Strip being remote from the West Bank. So the people in the Gaza Strip probably don't recognize the authority of President Abbas in the PA, and probably has no real control over Gaza. And he has control over the occupied territories on the West Bank, but only to the extent that the Israelis give him permission. So, like, they can't have their own military. They can't open the international airport. So they're subject to Israeli control. So we clearly, and you notice I start saying we clearly do not have an independent nation state, but we have an authority sanctioned by the Israeli government that the United States used to fund, but President Trump cut off all of their funding when President Abbas said, we're not going to participate in your so-called peace plan. And so Trump said, fine, then I'm cutting you off and I'm moving the American embassy to Israel, to Jerusalem. So the PA, now the European Union funds a lot of the PA stuff. So the Palestinian or the Israeli government says you may exist, you can have elections, and you can control certain things, but some of the bigger stuff you cannot control. And so it's like a government, even though it's really not. But he is the president, and there's lots of Palestinians who do not like him. A lot of Palestinians who do not like the PA. The problem is that's exactly what's happening throughout this conflict. The Palestinians and the Arabs cannot agree. And it looks like there's some Arab countries that are pushing the Palestinians to accept Trump's plan. So the constant is this constant divide, whereas the Israelis have dissenters, but they're pretty much united, although that's weakening a little bit, but not much. And it'll be interesting to see what happens in the March election.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, he's a president. He's not considered a head of state. But remember that the Palestinian Authority has a seat in the General Assembly of the UN. Observer status, basically, because you have to be a country to join the General Assembly. But we are there and we can speak. We just don't. And some of the other countries that recognize us, like Sweden, there's a few others I can't remember. So I like to call us a quasi-state. We act like a state, we walk like a duck, we talk like a duck. At some point we become a duck. There's walk like a duck, talk like a duck, act like a duck. I forgot there were three. That's an oldie. So it has nothing to do with Palestine, just think of ducks. So we act as if we are a nation state, even though we clearly are not. So any other questions or comments? Want to take another sip of my lukewarm hot coffee?
Are the students that watch on YouTube participating in this then too?
Yeah, probably what I'm going to have to do with them is they can certainly participate by doing research and writing. They can, and certainly if I put something on the camera, once we get to the point of opening statements, they can tell us, critique it. Because what I'll do once we get to the point of opening statements, I'll share it with everybody. So they'll see it too. So it's a little challenging, but like with this assignment, they're doing the exact same thing you guys are. Just that I emailed it to them. Yeah, this one's going to be challenging. Because the other ones are 3 ways. This is 4-way, and I've never done this before. It's one thing if we're all in the room, and I can bounce back between or among all 3 campuses. But increasingly with Dunkirk and Olean, we have to do that. So at some point, what we want to do with the simulation scenario is look at what Joyce has to say about Palestine as of January. Still got to go back and finish the article from 2014, which was an attempt to give us a picture of Palestine before all of this stuff started. And then typically, this January is the first time I haven't done it because of all kinds of problems. But there's something called the Model European Union that Jamestown always participates, usually playing the role of Sweden. And certainly when we did it in April back in New York City, one of our delegates pushed so hard on the Palestinian issue that he basically got the simulation, which is all countries of the European Union, meeting at the SUNY Global Center in Manhattan, and my students for Sweden, And these are colleges from across the United States and Europe. We're the only community college, but our student actually got an award for being, it was a compliment, it was the most hard-headed. He just would not relent. He just said, we're not doing anything about Sweden at these negotiations. About Palestine. Sweden recognizes Palestine's right to exist as a nation state. Now, this is being done face to face. Typically with schools, everybody is a senior, junior, or graduate student, and my student, he was great. He just dug in his heels and said Sweden absolutely objects to going any further with this. And so it got to the point that they had to remove Palestine from the agenda. So they didn't do anything positive, but they didn't do anything negative, and it was because he was so stubborn. So that was his negotiating stuff. So we typically do this every year, even years in Europe, odd years in Manhattan. So the next one would be April 21. But in 2018, one of my very incredibly bright students, she didn't want, well, actually, sorry, it's trans, he goes by he. He didn't want to be a government, he wanted to be a reporter. And so during the simulation, we put out a newsletter, a newspaper. In fact, I have it right here. This is from 2018. The SUNY News, that's the Model European Union. Is, by the way, the very first Model European Union ever in the United States. Started by six schools, just like the EU was started by 6 countries. And we were one of the 6. This is back in 1988, so you guys weren't even alive, which is very depressing to me. It was at the beginning of my academic career. I had only been here 2 years. And we started this, and it grew, and then it became the first transnational one because it involved European students. And then eventually we got this newsletter, and Avery, you can see his name down there, Avery Srawatka. This was the opening edition, because we're there, this was in Brussels. We were there for 4 days, 5 days, I forget. But this was issue 1, so it was the very first issue in 2018. And because Avery had been working with the Swedish delegation, which is us, with me playing the role of the king, Carl Gustaf XVI, and one of my talented students, Sydney, was the prime minister. Of course, she had to get up in front of all these students and make the case for Palestinian statehood, which was totally consistent with the Swedish position. And I remember one of the students from Kosovo came up to her and said, that was bold, and it was. But Sydney, she was great. She handled it really well. So she's standing up in front of hundreds of people, students, faculty, all at a much higher level than herself, and she blew them away. I was really proud of her. It was great. I loved every minute of it. So Avery decides to do this opinion piece, as you can see, and she did an excellent job. Now, the only problem with this opinion piece is that for some reason the editor cut off a little ending piece, but it's still excellent. So you can see it's titled, Colonial Europe Created the Problem, Only the European Can Solve It. And the problem is the fact that Palestinians don't have their own country. And this was the European Union simulation. So my students playing the role of Sweden were pushing this issue. We've been doing this for years. Very similar to the real world. Not getting anywhere, constantly frustrated. But like I said, at the last one, we kept the EU from doing anything that would hurt us. Just couldn't get them to get any further to help us. But, you know, that sometimes in negotiations, you have to be able to accept the status quo and not go backwards. Well, Avery did this piece, and it was excellent. Avery is borderline genius. She didn't even need me, or excuse me, he. But I remember after the piece came out that one of the advisors to the delegation that came from Drake University in Iowa went to the other faculty members. She never talked to me, which kind of upset me. and basically accused me and Avery of being anti-Semitic. This is just in the context of a role-playing simulation, although we took it very seriously. And because of the article, we were accused of being anti-Semitic. Now, I don't think the article is anti-Semitic. You know, you can judge that for yourself. Avery did a lot of research and came up with an excellent piece. And at some point, I'll probably make copies of this and then share it with everybody. But let's take a look at it. No issue has been more discussed by the international community than Palestine. That's why I expect the president to bring it up tonight. Yet recent years have been marked by a lack of progress in solving of the so-called Palestine question, with European nations struggling to be heard. Europe has a long legacy in Palestine stemming from classical colonialism and hegemonic control. Anybody know what hegemonic is referring to?
Hegemony, how do you pronounce it?
Yeah, hegemonic.
Yeah, agreement without force. Right?
You said agreement without force?
Yeah, no,
But is it really an agreement or is it an imposed agreement? Like, you have no choice but to do what we tell you. It's just like the United States at one point had, like after World War II, we were hegemonic. The world had to, you know, there was agreement, but there really was no choice. You either do what the US said or you're out of luck. And that's what Avery is referring to here, that Europe pretty much determined the outcome in Palestine, going all the way back to right after that article from the National Geographic. Because then Avery takes us through a little bit of history. Following, I should have said dissolution, I don't know why he said dissolvement. But following the dissolvement of the Ottoman Empire in the aftermath of World War I, the Middle East was left in a political mosaic, he's very poetic, of incohesive states. God bless Avery, I like the way he writes. You know, political mosaic of incohesive states. You know, it basically means there's a lot of different little pieces and there's not any real cohesion to it. And of course, the Ottoman Empire ruled the Middle East and Turkey. It was headquartered in Turkey. It was a Muslim empire. Some of you might be familiar with it. It was already on the way out, and World War I pretty much wiped it out. Although if you go to Turkey, you can see remnants of some of the stuff they built. And they had a caliph, which is why ISIS and some of these other so-called Islamic terrorist groups are talking about establishing an international caliphate, because that's what's called the head of the Ottoman Empire. As it became increasingly clear that the region was rich in oil and other resources that could boost their growing industrial economies, European powers, particularly the British and the French, capitalized on the internal disorder. You know, I think you could even make the argument that they facilitated the disorder because it allowed them to impose hegemonic control and kept the Arabs fighting with each other and the Palestinians. In exchange for resources, the European powers promised the Arab rulers monetary support and protection from internal rebellion. Yet they were not interested in the stability of the region, nor in seeking out possible routes in attaining peace. Rather, they did so to strengthen their colonial project and gain geopolitical advantage. In the following mandate period, that's the period between when the British had the mandate from the League of Nations after World War I until 1947, when the British said, goodbye, we're leaving, pretty much that abruptly. They told people when they were leaving, but they just packed up and left. Rather, they did so to strengthen their colonial project and gain geopolitical advantages. In the following mandate period, for example, the Middle East was divided by the League of Nations, it's that mosaic, controlled by colonial powers with complete disregard for ethnic, linguistic, or religious differences. Those boundaries in the Middle East, for the most part, are totally and completely artificial. The British just kind of drew it on a map, and it was done by a guy who actually had never been in the Middle East. The British said, what kind of countries should we create, and what are their boundaries? And I forget the guy's name. But without ever having been there, just decided this is Iraq, this is Syria, and so on and so forth. Instead, new national boundaries were created based on resource distribution and strategic superiority. The newly formed states were jointly administered by European powers under the veneer of colonialism and occupation. In this regard, Palestine was no different. Palestine was, and I suppose is, unique in its role to serve as the new national home of the Jewish people. Part of the British mandate, the Balfour Declaration notes, and we've talked about this, quote, it should be His Majesty's government view, which would favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and we use their best endeavors to facilitate the attainment of the object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may, may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, of the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Now, unfortunately, this is on 2 pages, but I've talked to you a little bit about the Balfour Declaration. There's a couple of things we need to know. Notice it says, His Majesty government favors the establishment of a national home. It doesn't say a nation state. It was deliberately ambiguous. And if you were a Zionist, of the dominant theme of Zionism, you read that to mean an independent country. On the other hand, if you thought an independent nation state for Jewish people wasn't such a good idea, you could look at that and say, oh, national home, that just means they can go live there. So part of the problem always with Palestine is going all the way back to the Balfour Declaration, which is the start of the conflict right after World War I. The British screw up, then the Americans screw up, but the British screw up by deliberately being ambiguous because they were afraid if they said a nation state, the Arabs would immediately revolt, and they had problems in the 20s and the 30s with Arabs revolting. And they were afraid of the Zionists toppling them in an election back in Britain and eventually the United States because it wasn't clear enough. So they muddled their way through, which is the best way to put it, which sometimes happens, but it created the mess that now we still have. And then if you go on, may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities, which means the Palestinian people. But you notice it talks about Jewish people, but it never talks about Palestinian people. It's a backhanded slap because it doesn't say, it calls them the non-Jewish, like that would be like saying that I am non-Canadian in Jamestown. Well, I'm not Canadian, I'm an American, but why can't you call me an American? So the other thing that happened here is it talks about Jewish people twice, but it never talks, it calls the people who aren't Jewish, non-Jewish community. So that'd be like, I think everybody here might be Caucasian or white. It'd be like saying, that'd be like identifying me or you as a non-black person. I mean, why would you do that? That doesn't even make any sense, but that's exactly what they did. And then also, and then of course, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Because the other problem with the Balfour Declaration, it wanted to say Jews can go back, but when you get to that or the rights, that's saying, but if you're a part of the diaspora and you're in Europe or the United States or England or Australia, well, that's fine too. You don't have to go back to get your rights. The other thing that comes up here, notice it says the civil and religious rights. Notably lacking is political rights. Civil rights are the rights to freely express yourself. Religious rights are the right to attend church, mosque, or synagogue of your choice or not go at all. Civil rights can be the right to enter into a marriage with the person of your choice. Of course, at this time, they wouldn't be talking about same-sex marriage. But what, if you just say, I gave you examples of civil and religious rights, what type of rights appear to be missing that is never guaranteed to the non-Jewish communities? What other rights do you have as an American? You know, you have the right to free speech, the right to marry, the right to create life, the right to go to church if you choose. But you know what, especially given that it's 2020, what's one of the rights that hopefully a lot of Americans will be exercising later this year? Yes.
The right to vote.
The right to vote. Please note, and I love that Avery quoted this language because it doesn't guarantee the political rights, which is the right to vote, the right to run for office, the right to create your own government. You know, I wasn't there when the Balfour Declaration was issued by His Majesty's government, but this thing is filled with weasel words that I call them, and we'll back up on Swell Wednesday, and created the conflict that wasn't there for 4,000 years. That's why Avery says it was Europe that screwed this up. And that Balfour Declaration, written so as not to upset the Zionists, not to upset the Palestinians, but in this case, they don't even recognize the Palestinians as a people. Jeez. Sorry, I'm getting overheated. I get really angry at this day. Talk about a failure in international negotiations. Avery did such a wonderful job. We'll go back and take a look at this. He's my hero. I think he's at the UB. I'm expecting him to do fantastic things too, as I know you will. I'm looking forward to fantastic things. Well, don't forget the State of the Union. Want to see if the President brings up Palestine. Can't imagine that he won't, but he doesn't consult with me. Actually, he should.